Hey there! I'm Chroma, and today I'll be showing you how to make a twin-stick shooter, being able to move with the WASD keys and shooting with the arrow keys. This is sort of a part 2 kind of thing, where I've made a previous tutorial covering the movement of a top-down shooter, but now we will be finishing that off and making the shooting part of it. Now, if you haven't seen that tutorial, you should be able to follow along just fine, as the actual shooting will be relatively independent of the movement, as is usually the case with a twin-stick shooter. So without further ado, let's get started. Starting things off, we are more or less where the top-down movement tutorial ended, where, simply enough, we have a character that we can move around, and we can bonk into things and all that good stuff. As well, the post-processing effects are quite different than they were last time. I'm not going to go over this too much, that's a tutorial for another day, but if you're curious, these are the exact settings with post-processing that created this effect, going from this to this. But beyond that, I'm just going to quickly, in under a minute, just recap what we have here so that following along should be as easy as possible. Now, in terms of what we have up here in our scene, we have a main camera that's just, for the most part, default, other than the background color. The post-processing effects that's going on here. We have a player with a sprite renderer that actually, if I go into this sprites folder here, we have 3 sprites here, a circle, a square, and a triangle, just to have things to use in our scene for 2D sprites, more or less. We have a rigid body 2D on our player to be able to move around. These are more or less the default settings for that. Then we have a box collider, which actually probably should be a sphere collider for our player here, but that doesn't really matter too much, because it could change depending on what sprites you actually are using. And then we have a player move script down here that, again, not going to go into this too much, but just so that we're all on the same page, I'm just going to quickly scroll through. This is what our current move code looks like, and we're not going to be touching it at all in this tutorial because the shooting is going to be completely independent from that. So, back over in Unity, we as well just have the environment that we have set up. That's just a background and then 4 walls with colliders on them. Simply enough. Now in our assets folder, we have an empty prefabs folder that's eventually going to contain our shot. We have the scene that we're in, and then 3 scripts, that 2 of which are empty because we're going to be coding them here today, and then this sprite folder that I just mentioned a few moments ago. So now we can begin actually setting up our player shooting system. And to begin doing that, we're going to want to create an actual shot that, like a projectile that we're going to be able to shoot from our player. So let's get started on that. So over in our sprites folder, we're going to be using this white triangle here to actually be our projectile. So we're going to move that just out of the way so we can sort of see it better in the scene view here. We're going to want to shrink it down first, just to have it be a right size for our player to shoot. We're going to go with 0.25 and 0.5. That's good enough. It's also stretched more, so it just looks better as a projectile. And then for the sake of this green color scheme here, I'm just going to sort of color it to be green. That does not matter too much. Now, in order to get it to move, we're going to be using the physics system, just like we have with the player. So we're going to be adding a rigid body onto our player here, or more specifically, a rigid body 2D. Now, we're going to want to set gravity scale to 0, because we don't want to be falling. This isn't a 2D platformer. We're treating this as a top-down perspective. As well, we're just going to freeze the rotation on the Z-axis under constraints here, just to make sure that we're going to be controlling the rotation of this shot ourselves. And we just want to make sure that even though nothing should rotate it, just making sure nothing does. Unless, for some reason, that you wanted to in your games. Now that we have this, we want to get the shot to actually move across the screen. And more specifically, we are going to be rotating it, and then whatever is its forward direction, so kind of this point here, we're going to get it to move in that direction relative to whatever way it is rotated. So in order to do that, we're going to need to do some coding. So over in the scripts folder, I've already just made the empty scripts here. So we're going to go into this one, shot controller, and get started on that. Now, normally I don't like naming code files with controller at the end, because I like to have things more modular, so maybe like shot mover and then shot collision or something like that. But for the sake of this tutorial, it's not going to be a lot of code, and just keeping it more concise and all in one place as best as I can. We're just going to have one big-ish code file to have all of that. So to get started here, we are going to want to get reference to the rigid body that we just made so that we can do physics stuff and get it to move. So we're going to want to start by getting a private rigid body 2D, again, making sure to have the 2D suffixes because we're working with a 2D game here, or more specifically because in the inspector we have a rigid body 2D and 2D colliders and all of that. But the principles that we're about to be going through should be the same for if you're making a 3D game or a 2D game that happens to use this kind of movement system. Next, we are going to be getting a reference to that rigid body in start so that we can actually do stuff with it. So in start, we can go rigid body equals get component rigid body 2D. All right, now that we have that, over an update, we're going to then be actually moving our shot here. So there's a few different ways that we can go about doing that. Two specific ways that we're going to just take a look at. The first being using rigidbody.add force, or more specifically add relative force because we want it to move relative to the way that it's moving in. So we can use this to then, we're going to need a direction that we're actually applying this relative force in, that we're going to pass in vector2.up. And then it would be vector3.up if it was a 3D game, I guess. This circumstance actually would probably be vector3.forward depending on the way that your projectile is rotated. But for the most part, this should then apply force in the up direction of our sprite, which for us is where that point of the triangle is. So as well, just to have, to be able to better deal with this in the inspector, we're going to make a public float called move speed, just as something that we can set in the inspector for the actual move speed there. It's pretty self-explanatory. And then we are going to just pass that into the relative force there. Now this is one way of going about moving that shot there. Now this would allow us to, we'll have the shot sort of speed up or slow down depending on how you set drag and all that sort of stuff, which might be the behavior that you want with this shot. But for what we're going to be creating here, we want a more consistent shot speed. So it has more constant velocity, more or less. So two ways that we can go about doing that is with adding forces. If we add a comma here, we have another parameter that we can add here, a force mode, or force mode 2D. We have two options here. By default, if you don't put anything here, it's using force mode 2D .force. We can set it to force mode 2D .impulse, and that'll make it more of an impulse force that's more of a direct velocity change with this movement speed. Now, another thing we can do that is doing more or less the same thing for the most part is just directly setting the velocity. We can go rigidbody.velocity is equal to, this would be transform.up times move speed. And this is doing the same thing with transform.up being the same sort of getting that relative up direction based on the rotation of the object. As well, since we are using rigid body physics stuff, we're just going to want to change the name of update to fixed update. So with this, we simply already have a way to get our projectile to move. So now if we head over back into Unity and then go and actually add our script here to the shot here, and we can actually go and rename that, I guess, to maybe player shot in case, whoa, that's not what I wanted to do. To player shot, I suppose, in case you have multiple shots, like a player shot and enemy shot, and you want them to have different behaviors and named differently, I suppose. And we can try setting that to 5, and if we just move it down here, hit play, we can see that, ta-da, it is moving. And then it's moving up forever. Is it? Yes, it is. We're going to want to handle that in a few seconds, but we'll also notice that if we rotate it, it's actually moving forward relative to the way that it is facing. Now, it might be hard to see because I kind of zoomed out quite a lot, but yeah, we can see that it is moving relative to its forward direction. Or technically it's up direction, but the forward, this point, basically. You know what I mean. So with that all set up, we're going to be doing more to the shot in a few moments, but it's set up enough now that we can then worry about our player actually creating it and having it, you know, be spawned where the player is and then move in the direction that we want to shoot in. So now that we have this, we're going to be making it a prefab so that we can instantiate it through the player. So we can just drag the player shot down here and it's a prefab. Now we can just go and delete it up in the inspector here. So now on the player, we want to go and start making it shoot. So we are going to go over to our scripts and we have this player shoot script that's empty or just making a new script. And we can open that up and begin getting our player to shoot. So how we are going to go about this, we are going to need quite a few things. So first and foremost, we're going to need a reference to the actual shot that we're going to be firing. So we are going to be getting a reference to the prefab that we just made by just going public, game object, and we can call it player shot, I suppose. Yeah, we're going to need to be making more variables as we're going through this, but we can sort of get to that when we get there. So in our update function, we want to test whether or not we currently can shoot. So to do that, actually, we're going to be going right back up here and making a Boolean based on whether or not we currently can shoot. Because let's say we want a delay to, let's say, every 0.2 seconds or something like that between every time that we fire, so that it's not just a constant stream of bullets. So we're going to make a variable called can shoot, and we're going to be setting that sort of false and true as we want to. So in our update function, we can say if can shoot, and then have our shoot code here. Now in start, we can have can shoot equals true, just so at the start of the game we can shoot by default, basically. Now this might not be what you want, depending on what you're doing with your game, but for our purposes, this is what we want. So in order to shoot, we want to get input from the, not the WASD keys, the arrow keys, to be able to see what direction we actually want to fire in, and then launch a bullet in that direction. So first we're going to want to actually go and get our input from our arrow keys. So in order to do that, we can just go input.getKey. Now, in this case, we're going to use getKey because we're assuming that we can hold the buttons in those directions and then fire bullets in those directions. So we're going to use input.getKey, and then to get keyboard input, or to get arrow key input, we can use up arrow, down arrow, left arrow, and right arrow under those key codes there. So this would get whether or not we're currently holding the up arrow key. We're actually going to store that input in a variable to then use it where we want to in a few moments to get the direction there. So we're just going to make another variable called a Boolean that we're just going to call, let's say, input up, or input shoot up, maybe. Just input up works because it's in the player shoot script. That should be self-explanatory enough, hopefully. So we can go and basically do this. So we can save our input here in input up. And now we're going to do the same for the other four directions real quick. So we can just copy this and paste it 3 more times, and then rename these to input down, input left, and input right. And then do the same down here, where we just copy, paste, 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 and then go get input down. If I can type the right letters, then input left and input right. And then changing our input here to get keycode dot down arrow, left arrow, and right arrow, or whatever buttons that you want to get. Now, left arrow. Now it can be a good idea to do this sort of format rather than having a bunch of get key statements throughout your code, because then you have all your inputs in one place, and it can be a lot easier to change these buttons here. If you decided, oh, now I want to make it IJKL or WSD or something like that, it can be easier to have all these inputs in one place rather than them spread all throughout your code. So now, with that set up, we want to now take these inputs and calculate what our shoot direction is. But then also, if we're not pressing any of those buttons, we're not going to shoot at all. And how we're going to test that is when we're getting our shoot direction. If we have a shoot direction of 0, basically, or of nothing, then we're going to not shoot at all. So we are going to need to make another variable for that actual shoot direction. So we are going to use a vector2 for this, where, I guess, vector2.up is going to be shooting up, vector2.down is shooting down. Basically, yeah, the Y components are going to be our up-down shooting movement, and then the X component will be 1 or -1 based on shooting to the right or left. And then we can sort of combine those in order to get our diagonal shooting. Now, depending on what type of shooting, top-down shooter thing you're making, you might want to only shoot on the cardinal directions, up, left, right, down, or you would want to shoot diagonally, or full 360-degree movement with a joystick. Now we're just dealing with keyboard controls for now, so all we need to worry about is just up, down, left, right, and then the diagonals. But what I'm about to show you will also work if you want to get rid of that diagonal movement entirely. So let's make a vector2 that we're just going to call shoot deer, shoot direction, basically. And by default, it's going to be vector2.0. It's going to be sort of our if it's vector 2.0, then we're not shooting in any direction, so we're not going to fire at all. So now we need to go and actually set what that shoot direction is going to be. So in order to do that, we are going to need to test for our inputs. So we're going to start by testing if we've hit the up arrow key, and if we've done that, then we can go and set shoot deer.y equals 1. And then if we hit else if input down, then we can set shoot deer.y equals -1 in the opposite direction. Now this also sets up an interesting functionality where if we are holding both the up and down arrow keys at the same time, it'll default to shooting up, which may be what you want, or if you want that if they're pressing up and down at the same time, then it sort of cancel out, then it's 0. You could do that as well. I guess then you could also do shot deer.y minus equals 1, and then if it was 1, then it would go to 0. If it was 0 from this, then it would go to -1. That would work for canceling it out, but we're not going to do that here. We're just going to have sort of some defaults set up. And then with left-right movement, we're going to set right as the default there, I suppose. So if they're hitting the right arrow key and the left arrow key at the same time, it'll shoot right, basically. So then we're going to test for the right arrow key first by going if input right, then shoot deer.x equals 1, and then else if not that, else if input left, then shoot deer, whoa, not all that. Okay, shoot deer.x equals -1. And then that should work just great there. So now that we have both of those shoot deer directions, we want to first test if our way of testing if we've hit any input at all is just seeing if shoot deer is equal to vector 2.0. So we can go and test that. Shoot deer is equal to, or is not equal to vector 2.0. That means that it's equal to something, so we want to shoot in that direction. So then down here, we finally have our code of everything is a go. We need to fire a projectile in the direction that we want to fire it in. So in order to do that, we're going to use the instantiate function. Now, I've covered this in a previous video. You can also, well, actually, I'm about to explain it, so you don't really need to search up anything. Instantiate allows you to spawn game objects in the scene. In this case, it's going to be our shot prefab. So we are going to pass in the actual object that we want to instantiate, which in this case is our player shot. Then we want to say where we want to spawn it, which in this case is on the player's position, which is where this script is attached to, so we can go transform.position. Now the rotation is the tricky bit, and that's what we're using our shoot direction for. So now what this shoot direction is going to be is quaternion dot look rotation. Now quaternion is a complicated thing. Rotations are a complicated thing in Unity, so I'm not going to go too into depth into the math or whatever behind this. We're just going to do it and it's going to work. So quaternion.look rotation is going to generate a rotation that is looking towards a vector that we define. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, in this case, we need to define a forward direction and an upward direction. Now, normally with a 3D game, that forward direction would probably be what you want, and that's what you'd set as this like look rotation. If you're following this tutorial with a 3D game, you would probably set shot deer to that forward direction. But because we're dealing with a 2D game and the way that sprites work, we're actually just going to set vector 3, like this forward direction here, to vector 3 dot forward, which is going to be sort of that axis that doesn't exist in 2D that's sort of going away or like towards the camera. And then as the upwards direction, that's going to be shoot deer. Now, that's basically because the upward direction of our sprite is what we want to set to that shot deer direction. So now we have all of that. That will instantiate our shot successfully. So now we want to make sure that we can't fire an endless stream of bullets. So we're going to want to sort of have a delay between when we can shoot again. So we are going to use a coroutine for that. Now scrolling down, we're going to make a new function that is an enumerator or a coroutine, which basically allows us to have delays in Unity. We're going to call it wait to shoot, and then we can then have a delay, and we're going to call it up here. So this can shoot boolean that we made, we are going to set that to false to start off, and then we're going to wait a few seconds or 0.2 2 seconds or something super small between when we want to be able to fire again. And how we can go about setting that delay is this long line of return new, wait 4 seconds, and then we can pass in a time here. Now this, for the simplicity's sake of being able to edit things better in the inspector, we are going to make a another variable at the top that's going to be our delay, I suppose. So we can call this shot delay, I guess. Again, the names are arbitrary, they don't matter too much. Now, with that, we can stick that in here, and after waiting this delay, we can then go and set can shoot equal to true again. And that'll allow us to then have this return true so we can get all this input and all this. Now, another thing here is that we have the can shoot before we test the input, because if can shoot is false, we can't shoot. There's not really a point in getting the input for the most part. Although one thing we will want to do, just to make sure that things work how we want them to, is at the beginning of this, before we actually calculate all the shoot direction stuff, we just want to go shoot deer equals vector 2.0. Just sort of resetting it every time we're about to use it, just to make sure that if we set it to 1 here, next frame it would still be equal to 1. So if they stop hitting a button, it would just still shoot in that direction, which isn't what we want, or maybe it is what you want, depending on what type of game you're making. But for us, it isn't, so we're just going to make sure to reset it right before we use it. And then I'll just put some extra space there just for clarity's sake. So now, with all of this, we can then go and call this coroutine here by going start coroutine wait to shoot. And that will do all that for us here. So now we have all the code necessary to actually shoot our projectile here. Now, one small thing I just want to add, just for organization's sake up in the inspector, we're going to make another game object called transform, and actually, yeah, we're going to call this shots parent, I guess. And actually, I'm going to go back into Unity to show what I'm about to do with this. Just waiting for our code to compile here. So we have all these objects in our inspector here. We're actually going to make a empty game object that we're going to call maybe projectiles, I guess. Again, the name doesn't matter. And this is basically going to be an empty object that's just going to have all of our game, or all of our projectiles, our player shots, maybe enemy shots or whatever inside of it, just to have be able to have more organization here, being able to have this sort of drop down list with the projectiles if we wanted that. Now, how we're going to make sure that our shots become parented under this projectiles thing, we can get a reference to it here, which is what we're about to do, and then this shots parent, over in our instantiate function, we can actually, if we add another comma, there's another thing that we can have, which is just setting what the parent is going to be, which we can just set to our shots parent. Perfect. And with all of that, we should be all done with getting the player to shoot. We still have a few more things to do with the actual bullet itself, but let's go and add that player shoot code to the player itself. And now we have a few variables here that we're going to need to set. So we're going to set the shot delay to 0.2, I think, and then we want our player shot, that's going to be this prefab that we just made, and then our shot parent is going to be this projectiles game object up here. So now, fingers crossed, going into play mode, we should now be able to, that is shooting really fast. Oh, okay. Did I set this to, 0.02. Yeah, that might be a bit too slow. It's working as we want it to. I just set the variable way too low. Unless you want it that low, and again, want to fire an endless stream of bullets. But there we go. We basically have the ability to shoot. Now you'll notice the bullets are going through walls, they aren't colliding with anything, and if we look under here, they are lasting forever. And eventually we're going to have a lot of bullets cluttering up the screen, and we don't want all of this mess outside the game area where we're not going to be, we don't want them to exist. This could also be a problem where if you had a really big level and you're shooting things that are way off screen, that could probably perhaps be a problem that you might want to handle. So we have our bullets existing and they are firing in the direction that we want to fire them in. Actually, as well, I guess one thing I can quickly do is if we wanted to get rid of that diagonal movement, we could just have a bunch of else ifs in here, I suppose. Actually, just doing this would make it so that if you're heading up, it's up, then down, then right, then left. Whatever order you want this to be in, this could be then how you could get rid of any diagonal movement by making it so that you can only fire in one direction. But I'm going to undo that because I want to be able to fire in the diagonal directions. As well, if you wanted to have that sort of 360 movement with a joystick, I'm not going to be covering that here, but you'd want to deal with how you actually get input from a joystick and then use that to basically set these Y and X values. Instead of being a hard value of 1 or -1 or 0, having them sort of be somewhat in between those values. And if you look up, I think it's input.getAxis and that sort of input stuff with how you'd get input from a joystick, you should be able to figure out everything you need to do there to be able to set these shoot deer values to what you need them to get that 360-degree movement. But with a keyboard, that's not something we can really show off here today, but maybe one day in the future I'll make a tutorial on that. But anyways, so now we want to go and clean some things up. Well, not clean things up, but clean up our, make our bullets better and actually collide with things and not last forever. So over in our player controller code, we're going to be adding some things to it. So first, let's go and make it so we can collide with things. The main thing that we need our bullets to do. So in order to do that, we are going to be using onTriggerEnter. And actually, that reminds me, before I forget, because I feel like I probably will, over on our actual player shot here, we will want to make sure that our collider, we actually never put a collider on this. That's an important step. We're going to make a box collider 2D. I'm just going to move that above our code there. And then we're just going to make sure to set it to isTrigger, just so that we have this collider here so that we can test collisions with the environment and enemies and all that stuff. So now under here, we are going to be going void onTriggerEnter 2D. Remember the 2D because 2D, everything else with the rigid bodies and colliders and all that sort of stuff, just keep it consistent. Otherwise, it probably won't work the way that you expect it to. So then we can go if we want to test what we collided with. Because if we could have it be that whatever we collide with, it destroys this shot, but we might not want that because then we could have some funky things going on where it could hit like the player itself and get destroyed. If it hits other player shots maybe, then it would destroy itself, stuff like that. So we're going to want to just sort of test, for now, 2 cases. One case where it hits the environment, so the walls, and it'll destroy just itself. And then another case where if it hits like an enemy or a hazard or something like that, and it will destroy itself and the enemy. For now, we're not going to deal with health. That's a bit beyond the scope of this tutorial. Again, a topic for another day. But we're just going to have it, if it hits something that we decide is an enemy or a hazard, it's just going to destroy it completely. So how we can go about testing that is we can go call it collision dot, that's getting a reference to the thing that we collided with. And there's this useful function called compare tag that we're going to make use of. And we're going to type in the tag environment. We can make this tag whatever we want it to be, but we're going to use this environment tag to tell Unity what things we want to call the environment. So, or like the walls all around the level, basically. So if we hit this thing that we decided is the walls and all that, we want to destroy the thing that we are attached to, so the actual bullet itself. But we don't want to destroy the wall, unless, again, you want that to be the case. So we can use this function, destroy game object. Now, yeah, that will then get rid of our shot here. And then we have another case where if we hit a thing that we are deciding is an enemy, and we can copy this, and we can use collision.compareTag enemy. And if we hit an enemy, then we can destroy, we're again going to still destroy this bullet, but we're going to as well destroy the enemy itself. So we can use the same function and go collision.gameObject. And that's the thing that we collided with, which we just proved is an enemy. We want to then destroy that. So getting our brackets here, and with all of that, we should, oh, and then another thing here as well. So for now, when we destroy the bullets, they're just going to kind of go away, but this could also be the place where you want to spawn cool explosions and all that, because yeah, just more visual flair. But we're not going to cover that here today, but that would be where you could go ahead and do all of that fun stuff. So back in Unity on our player shot, actually we don't need to add anything to there. Over on our walls, what we're going to do is up here, oh, I never undid that, but we have a tag. By default, it'll be untagged. We have a bunch of tags here, and you can go to add tag, and you can add tags here. Now, I already went and added an environment tag and an enemy tag, but how you do that is just going plus, and then type in a tag there, and then you'd have it here. Now, just setting it here doesn't actually set the thing that you wanted to set the tag of, you want to make sure to, after adding tags here, go back to the things that you want to set, which in our case is just these 4 walls here, and then we can set them to the environment tag. Now, we don't actually have an enemy here, but that's okay. We can go ahead and make one. I'm going to copy a wall here because it's essentially the same thing. We can make it smaller, and we can make it a nice red, just so it stands out that it's evil, I guess. Then we can make it maybe just a bit smaller. You know, that does, again, it doesn't really matter. But then we can go and change it to enemy, and then we can go and tag it as enemy. So now, except it didn't rename, so enemy, enemy. There we go. And then we can, if we want to, we can go and just copy and paste a few of these around our level. You can't really call it a level. Well, you kind of can, but it's, yeah. So now we should be able to, aha, there we go. So now when we're hitting the environment, our shot is disappearing. Now again, you could have a cool explosion or whatever when that happens, so that you don't see the blip of it sort of going away. And now, if we hit these enemies, they also get destroyed and they disappear and all that. So woohoo, we got all of that. Now you could also make another empty game object here to store all our enemies, but we don't really need to worry about that. But yeah, that for the most part deals with how our shots collide with things. Now, one small thing that we want to handle is in the case where if we have like a really long level or there's just some, opening here, if we shoot way off into the distance, we want our shots to get destroyed after a certain amount of time of them not hitting anything, just so they don't travel forever. So how we can do that is actually quite simple. We can first go and set a public variable, basically for how long we want the bullet to last before it gets destroyed. And we're going to call this destroy time. And then over in our start function, we can use the same destroy function that we've been using throughout this video, except we have another thing that we can do with it, where we can destroy this game object, but we can pass in a time. So the amount of time, actually right here, the optional amount of time of delay before destroying the object, and we can pass in the destroy time. So as soon as this object exists, it's setting itself to be destroyed in however many seconds we decide. So that will then allow us to, if we go back to our player shot and set this to, if we left it at 0, it would destroy itself immediately. But let's set it to something small, just so I can show that it's working, I suppose. So now if we set it to something small as 1 second, it gets shot, and after 1 second of it existing, that is not the desired effect. I'm not sure why that, oh wait, no, yes it is. Except there's something happening with not being able to shoot, but no. Oh, never mind. No, okay, never mind. We're good. Okay, cool. So we are able to shoot, and then after a second, it gets destroyed. Okay, I was worried there. I thought it wasn't working, but no, we're all good. So with all of that, we now have a projectile that we can shoot, and it's more customizable and all that. This shooting was semi-inspired by the game The Binding of Isaac. That's where the movement was sort of inspired from. I've sort of deviated it from it here because the actual more stuff behind that shooting is way more complex than I want to get into here. There's a lot of different settings that can be changed with the type of bullets that you can shoot in that game. Or a lot of top-down shooters where you get a bunch of different weapons and all the different projectiles that enemies shoot. This can get very complex very fast. But for the most part, yeah, we have a basic shot that can be shot from our player. And for the most part, if you wanted to modify some of those values, you can do that by just making more variables here. So like different destroy times or move speeds or the size of the shot itself. And then you could have other scripts. So let's say if you get a power up that makes it so you can shoot faster, then you could just decrease the shot delay for a few seconds and stuff like that. And then ideally, yeah, you could then change the bullets that you're firing as you are shooting them. If you wanted to have a bullet that was spawning other bullets or something, you could then have a coroutine that then after a few seconds instantiates another bullet or something like that. Although you want to be very careful of that not sort of endlessly spawning bullets and then very quickly you have just an endless thing of bullets being spawned. So you want to be careful of how you go about doing stuff like that. But yeah, for the most part, that does it for this tutorial. So now we have the ability to shoot, we can destroy enemies, we could make these actual like big hazards, and maybe you could like have a big thing here that you have to shoot in order to be able to actually progress and stuff like that. And yeah, so that will do it for this tutorial. So thank you all so much for watching. If you have ideas for tutorials that you want to see, please leave them in the comments below. Now I have a challenge for you. Now that we've done player moving and shooting, I want you to combine them, which is probably what you're doing if you're watching this tutorial. You'll probably have movement set up, but I want you to combine being able to move and shoot and have this basically the basics of a top-down shooter set up, and I want you to do something cool with it. If you're watching this to make, like you're learning how to make games and all that, make something with this. Make something that's actually, or do something unique and creative, and just see what you can do with the tools that you have made here and how very customizable that they are. And there's a lot of unique, interesting things that you could do with this. For example, I'm just going to toss something out there. If you are here where you parent something, or you parent the shot to the player, or not to the player, to a separate parent object, if you decided to set the parent as the player object itself, and then go into play mode here, then you get a pretty neat effect here where as you're shooting, okay, never mind, that didn't work as I thought it would, but there is a way that you could make it sort of follow the player as the player moves, and then you can do some interesting stuff with that as an example. Or maybe you could set up stuff to have a bullet bounce off walls somehow by when it collides with something, sort of inverting its velocity and stuff like that. Okay, I'm suggesting things that are a bit more complicated, but be more creative than me and see if you can come up with some unique, interesting mechanic, or make a full-on actual level about this, and then, yeah, just see what interesting things that you can come up with. But that's where I'll leave you. So thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you around.